Alrighty, guys, so welcome to our fourth and final architect biography. So today we're going to be talking about one of my other favorite architects. Kind of a controversial architect, right? Either people really love him or they really hate him, but this is the genius, the prodigy Le Corbusier. So you notice by these dates down here, right? He wasn't born in 1900. This is kind of when his career started. So he's kind of working in the exact same scene of architecture as Frank Lloyd Wright, except he's sort of the European version. He's from France. He really very intensely influences the scene of European modern architecture, just like Frank Lloyd Wright is doing in America at this over this long time, over these multiple decades, right? So Le Corbusier is one of the most influential modern architects in the modern world. I would argue leagues more influential to modern architecture today than Frank Lloyd Wright ever was. He's really the father of brutalism. He's one of the fathers of modernism. I would argue the other father of modernism is Mies van der Rohe, which I don't specifically have a biography about, a lecture about. We talked about him a little bit in the last class. We're going to talk about him a little bit in the next class. But I chose Le Corbusier because I'm just a little bit more of a fan of his work. I understand his work philosophy a little bit more than Mies van der Rohe, so I can kind of expand upon it more for you guys. I think this class might be a little bit of a long one. I have a lot to say on Le Corbusier, and because we're not constrained for time, I decided to shove it all in one lecture. It might run a little bit long. If it does, feel free to watch this in two parts, just like the Frank Lloyd Wright ones. So, a lot of you might already, looking at these pictures, think of his work as rather soul sucking and grave. A lot of people do. But, I rather like some of it. I think being in these spaces, I'd imagine, truly makes you neutrally minded, truly makes you able to meditate in a very neutral way. And that's kind of a lot of what he was going for. He famously built a Benedictine monastery, and it's somewhere I definitely want to visit just because I feel like it would put me in such a neutral headspace, not burdened by anything from the past. And the other big thing he did was invent what's called the Domino plan, and we're going to talk about this today, a plan of building that absolutely revolutionized every single aspect of modern architecture in the modern world. Le Corbusier had a little bit of a later start than Frank Lloyd Wright, but in all of his works, there's this continual idea of bringing people to a neutral mindset, making people happy, making machines for living, and creating the ideal space for healthiness and happiness. He was ready to demolish entire neighborhoods of old Europe for the good of his inhabitants, to allow them to spread out, to allow them to get sunlight. A lot of these old neighborhoods in Europe still had very narrow medieval streets, very antiquated buildings. He was very positive about the bombed out cities of World War II because they needed so much restructuring, and he really contributed more than any other architect to the aesthetic and to the philosophy of the post World War II reconstruction in Europe. I know it seems weird looking at these pictures to think that these buildings make healthy, happy places for humans to live, but hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll come to a sense of understanding of Le Corbusier's vision and be able to sort of appreciate at least some of his buildings for what they are, for what they stood for in their time period. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, we see these movements coming and trying to distance themselves and get away for what Le Corbusier stood for with the rise of expressionism and postmodernism. But keep this in mind. Though this looks very modern, this isn't the end of architecture. This isn't the cutting edge anymore. Le Corbusier's work is not cutting edge anymore. So as we go through this lecture, try to appreciate it for what it stood for in its time. So without further ado, let's get on with the life story of Le Corbusier. So let's get to his birth in 1887. It was in 1887 in Switzerland that Charles Edouard Jeanneret was born, the man who would later change his name to become the great Le Corbusier. He grew up in a family of hereditary watch engravers, and so Le Corbusier was always destined to become a watch engraver like his father. He was sent to his local town school of applied art in 1900s, and his art teachers saw in him a very rational and construction-based mind and suggested that he try, instead, architecture. Following his teacher's advice, Le Corbusier, at the age of just 17, enrolled to study architecture, but he had a very slow and patient start to his career, unlike, say, Frank Lloyd Wright. His ideas, inspiration, and personal style took decades to develop into something mature. So, while studying architecture, he actually persuaded one of his teachers, an arts and crafts architect, as this was in vogue at the time, this teacher named Charles L'Implantinier, to entrust the construction of a friend's house to him when he was only 18 years old, and this would become the Villa Fillet you see here. Le Corbusier's first work ever. So after 2 years in design and 2 years in construction, this house was completed in 1907, and above all, it was done in a vernacular style appropriate to the region of the Jura Mountains. At the moment, industrialization began to threaten craft culture. In a way, it was another arts and crafts house. In another, it was traditional. Le Corbusier's teacher was sympathetic to the authors and principles of the arts and crafts movement, and so he advocated for respect of local culture, materials, and building methods. So in a way, Le Corbusier is acting very much like Charles Rene Mackintosh in his very early buildings, where he's just sort of slightly modernizing a traditional Swiss villa. But soon, Le Corbusier became absolutely convinced that he was wasting his time on too academic an education. So when he was 19 years old, he quit school and boarded a train bound for Italy. Sounds a lot like Frank Lloyd Wright. The young man decided that from then on he would educate himself through travel. He wanted to discover the greatest achievements in the history of architects. He soaked in the Roman ruins and the marvelous Renaissance constructions. He tirelessly drew all these buildings, taking measurements and scrutinizing them, in particular the Duomo in Florence. Then he went to Istanbul and marveled at the Eastern palaces, mosques, and churches. Then he went to Greece and explored Athens and obsessed over the Acropolis. During his travels across Europe, he actually got a job working for the Pierre brothers in southern France and discovered reinforced concrete, a relatively new construction material hardly being experimented with at the time in Europe, but one which would play later an essential role in his work. In 1912, he returned to his hometown in Switzerland, very eager to set up on his own. At 25 years old and without a degree, Le Corbusier opened his architect's practice. There, he would advertise himself as an architect of villas and homes in the Swiss country. For one of his first commissions, he actually just convinced his parents to spend their life savings on a new house he built in 1912 for them, the Villa Genere, a villa in the countryside. His parents had to go into debt to pay for such a grand project. This was because this house was substantial. Le Corbusier really wanted to experiment with what he'd learned from Italy in working for the Pierre brothers, elementary use of reinforced concrete. So the Villa Genere is the first of Le Corbusier's works really to reject the Swiss chalet style for a restrained sort of classicism. The interiors represent a genre of classical eclecticism in which Le Corbusier had encountered in vogue in Paris. But the house was basically a furnished, stripped-down empire-style building, a modern vernacular, sort of like Mackintosh, but in the empire style, in this sort of classic eclecticism. So, at this point in history, it's very obvious that Le Corbusier is still very much finding his way. He's building in these kind of stripped down historicist styles in vogue in Europe at this time, but he's not innovating in the slightest yet. And this makes him kind of late to the modernist architecture scene. Frank Lloyd Wright was already building Taliesin at this point. And commissions were rare. He designed only 3 houses in the span of 5 years. So, in the end, Le Corbusier found that his hometown was just too small a stage for him to show the extent of what he thought was talent. At 30 years old, Le Corbusier spontaneously moved to Paris, the cultural capital of Europe. He actually arrived in Paris in 1917 in the middle of World War I when it was subjected to bombings, and so he spent most of the war in bombing shelters in Paris. But during the post-war reconstruction, he borrowed more money from his parents to open up a humble architect's practice, but it really didn't take off. So unemployed, impoverished, and depressed, Le Corbusier subsisted on borrowed money and made his living drawing advertisements for prostitutes at brothels. Soon, though, Le Corbusier was to make a friendship that would change everything. In 1918, Le Corbusier met the Cubist painter Amédée Ozenfant, in whom he recognized a sort of kindred spirit, and whom he hit it off with instantly. Ozenfant encouraged him to paint, and the two began this long period of collaboration. They both rejected the avant-garde painting style of the day, called Cubism, as irrational and romantic. The pair jointly supported and created a manifesto establishing a new artistic movement they called Purism. So the philosophy behind Purism would massively influence the philosophy behind Le Corbusier's later architecture, so listen closely. So the philosophy behind Purism was basically rooted in this desire to create a new aesthetic language that was suited to the modern age. The purist artists, believed that the traditional forms of art were no longer adequate for expressing the new technological and industrial realities of the 20th century. So in this genre, artists would take everyday objects from their own environments and reduce them to aesthetically pleasing shapes and forms that emphasized the simple beauty of the modern world. So, Purist painting was to play a large role for the rest of his life and strongly influence his architecture as he reduced his buildings to aesthetically pleasing shapes and forms that emphasized the beauty of the modern world. And so Ozenfant and Le Corbusier, in addition to their paintings, also began publishing this new journal, L'Esprit Nouveau, the New Spirit, and the most notable articles after some time coming out of this journal were those dedicated to architecture. They were signed by this mysterious and unknown character, Le Corbusier. Charles-Édouard Jeanneret had created this character for himself in 1920. From then on, he actually spoke of himself in the third person. He wrote to his mother, Le Corbusier does architecture alone. He is an entity released from the burden of flesh. Charles-Édouard Jeanneret is a man of flesh and blood who has experienced the radiant and desperate adventures of a rather turbulent life. So Charles had essentially reinvented himself. He wore plastic-framed round glasses and a black suit with a bow tie. He wanted to look like the up-and-coming mastermind he felt he was on the inside. And above all, this new friend would enable Le Corbusier to enter the very close circle of the Parisian artistic innovators. Ozenfant would introduce him to patrons, collectors, intellectuals, other painters in Le Corbusier's career in Paris. At this time also, Le Corbusier, before even building substantial buildings, wrote 34 entire architectural books. He established himself as one of the great theoreticians of modern architecture, but he was simply an armchair architect. Le Corbusier praised race cars, airplanes, and factories, marveling at the beauty of their efficiency and the purity and break from anything familiar. They were purely utilitarian. However, he also argued that beauty lay not in only the newest technology, but in the ancient works, such as the Parthenon, whose refined forms represented, in his view, the perfection of earlier archaic systems of technology and philosophy. So he used these photo montages like you see here on this slide to try and convince others that architecture needed to be developed away from the Victorian age, obsessed with historical mimicry, and toward a modern architecture. Here on this page, he compared a car to the Parthenon, and he asked, what is it about the Parthenon and the Ford Model T that seduces and moves us? He claimed that they were monuments that had reached an extraordinary level of refinement. This principle, he said, must be applied to housing, which was lagging behind. He worked to develop standardized, functional, and reproducible housing, machines for living in, as he said. But this was all still theory. No patrons were buying his ideas. In December 1914, though, Le Corbusier began to invent something absolutely revolutionary for the world of architecture. So he began this very serious study into the use of reinforced concrete as building material, and this led him to his plan for the Domino house. And this model proposed an open floor plan consisting of 3 concrete slabs supported by 6 thin reinforced concrete columns, with a stairway providing access to each level on one side of the floor plan. So he originally designed this Domino house plan as a cheap way to provide large numbers of residences after World War I in these shell-shocked cities, but as we'll see, the Domino plan really took off and became popular for architects in the post-World War II reconstruction. But the idea is that it produces only concrete slabs, columns, and stairways so that the residents could build exterior and interior walls with whatever local materials they had. So this would permit the construction of dividing walls at any point on the facade or the interior made of any material, because the weight-bearing structures are the reinforced concrete, which are already set in place. And you have to understand, this is fundamentally different from any previous architecture and constructions in the Western world, where you had to build walls which supported the flooring. You know, these walls obscure, whereas Le Corbusier's walls offer transparency because they're not supporting. In Le Corbusier's buildings, you can enclose an open space wherever you want to. And so under this system, the structure of a house did not have to appear on the outside. The entire exterior could be glass, and hopefully you're starting to see just how influential the Domino house was. This is still how we build skyscrapers today, modern apartment units, modern dorms, modern schools, the majority of our modern buildings. One of Corbusier's well-known passion projects was that he desperately wanted the chance to improve life in Paris, and he wrote tirelessly about his plans to do just this. You know, what shocked Le Corbusier most was how dirty and unsanitary Paris was, and how the narrow streets didn't let in any light. This was not a new view in architecture at the time. This was very popular among the modernists. Le Corbusier, though, took a little bit of an extremist view towards restructuring Paris. He actually wanted to flatten the center of Paris and build what he called the Plan Voisin. In 1925, he actually proposed this plan at a lecture, a grid of 18 skyscrapers, all built with the Domino plan, each of them 200 meters tall, that would comfortably house more than 3 million inhabitants. And these would be interspersed with roads 100 meters wide for cars to flow through. Already in this time period, in the 1920s, traffic in Paris was a major issue. Above all, Le Corbusier proposed just 3 elements that conditioned basic happiness that he thought modern Paris was lacking. And these 3 elements are sun, space, and trees. His city plans and his architecture would all be founded on maximizing these 3 factors. And so with this vertical architecture of the Plan Voisin, he could free up space on the ground. The green space would be immense. There would be parklands with sports fields, a stadium, a swimming pool, tennis courts, basketball courts, paths for pedestrians, fast trails that pass under the building. The city would be 12% built-up space and 88% parkland. He said he gave people a modern building so that they could look into the sky, contemplate the universe, think of themselves, and not be transfixed with showy facades all the time. Of course, in 1925, the popular press was outraged at this lecture, and it provoked a national debate. One part of the public saw Le Corbusier as someone who wanted to concrete over urban landscapes. Another part saw him as inspirational in dealing with the challenges of housing. But the Plan Voisin, of course, was never to get beyond theory, but it marks a turning point for city planning in history. You know, post-World War II Reconstruction architects would absolutely love this as they attempted to rebuild Europe's bombed out cities. They got really inspired by Le Corbusier's city plans, but this is something we're going to look at next lecture with the rise of the international style. In the 1920s, Le Corbusier's dedication to his writings and lectures finally paid off and his career was about to take off. He would achieve success not with towers, but his architectural practice in Paris started getting house commissions. In the 1920s, he constructed a dozen individual villas for friends and rich clients. These are the so-called purist villas. So in 1922, he constructed one of his first villas on the outskirts of Paris for his purist friend, the painter Amédée Ozenfant, with a huge corner glass wall in his studio. They were based off the demands of the machine age, inspired by the details of modern trains and ocean liners, in that they were made of mass-produced material. And these houses are all raised on slender columns in the classic Domino style. So this house had a garage on the ground level, and after climbing a spiral staircase it had a main reception room and bedroom on the next floor, and gallery for Ozenfant to exhibit his artworks in the rear, while on the top floor you can see a painting studio. Le Corbusier created this essentially procession of spaces which grew very much more open as one ascended. So one ascends from the first floor by a spiral stair through the compressed foyer into the expanding studio inundated with light. The final view is obtained by climbing through a trapdoor at the top of a studio ladder to a small rooftop garden. Again, you know, Le Corbusier's architecture is about maximizing sun, space, and trees, and you can tell wherever you stand in this apartment, you're getting a maximum exposure to the sun. You know, there was this prevailing view in health at the time that the more sun you got, the healthier you were. Primarily because most people living in historic cities at the time did not have large windows, if windows at all. And so much of the diseases of poor city dwellers were written off as lack of sufficient sunlight. In 1925, Le Corbusier created another purist villa, the Villa La Roche, designed for Raoul La Roche, a Swiss banker from Basel and collector of avant-garde art. So La Roche was very well enmeshed in Ozenfant and Le Corbusier's club of purist painters, and after visiting one of Le Corbusier's other villas, La Roche commissioned Le Corbusier to build him a gallery house combo to house his new purist collection. So, you know, from the success of this building and the extreme satisfaction of the clients of Le Corbusier, he developed the 5 points of architecture which he outlined in his new book, Toward a New Architecture, published in 1926. And these points were intended to guide himself and other modern architects in creating buildings that were functional, efficient, and aesthetically pleasing. And these guides were adding pilotis, having a free plan, having a free facade, having ribbon windows, and having a roof terrace. And I'm not going to ask that you memorize these or know these for a test, but do pause the video and read through these descriptions just so you begin to realize what Le Corbusier thinks is really important for architecture in his time and day. So this is the most famous of Le Corbusier's purist villas. This is the Villa Savoy, and you know, it's one of the most significant works in the history of 20th century architecture because it completely redefines the traditional appearance of a house, and it was the most iconic and praised of all of Le Corbusier's purist villas. The clients that Le Corbusier was designing this for, the Savoy family, they were essentially health-obsessed nuts in the 1920s. They wanted this weekend home, but they were very wealthy. They had servants. They required servants' quarters, but they wanted this weekend home where they could, you know, enjoy this rustic landscape in style, take in as much sunshine and outdoors as possible. So first thing I want you to notice is if you go back to the last slide, you'll notice this follows all 5 points of architecture. But essentially, the point of this house is to blur the difference between indoor and outdoor spaces. So on the first level, you have this car garage which can fit 3 cars, but also in this first floor, you have 2 servants' quarters and a restroom for the servants. And this whole ground unit is painted green to sort of blend in with the background behind it to give the appearance that the entire house is floating on these delicate pilotis. And since these pilotis hold up the bulk of the house, you can have the yard in the garden continue underneath the house. You can create more space for the children to play. You can create this great shaded area for leisure and for events. And you open up the yard instead of partitioning it into 4 spaces on 4 sides of the house. So as I said, you'll notice on the second level, the Villa Savoy integrates completely indoor and outdoor spaces, allowing the family to spend as much time outdoors in the most efficient way possible. So, this spiral staircase winds up from the garage. Just like Frank Lloyd Wright, the front entrance is essentially in the garage into what's called the salon, this interior space that then flows out seamlessly to a massive roof terrace outside. And the terrace is essentially treated as a room without a roof, a room without walls. And then, the ramp culminates on the 3rd floor in this curved solarium crowning the house, kind of looking like an abstract sculpture when viewed from below, but essentially it's a more private sun tanning area. So as you can tell, this is a house that definitely maximizes sun, space, and trees. The components Le Corbusier believed led to the most happy, healthy life. And living in this house allows for a lot of scenery changes, whether you want to work or rest in the kitchen, or in the open courtyard, or on the roof terrace, or in a bedroom, or under the house. No matter where you are, the house is always calling you to the outdoors, and always bathing everything in sunlight, encouraging you to plant gardens, plant trees, to beautify and ornament the space, and appreciate the sun, space, and forest around you. But the really revolutionary thing about this house is how Le Corbusier perfectly executes his principles of modern architecture, absolutely liberating the family house by allowing them to determine where space is enclosed or opened wherever they desire. And as a result, weekending in this house was like visiting a sanitarium. It cleared the mind and rejuvenated the body. So Le Corbusier's fame grew, and soon Le Corbusier was a member of the elite, frequenting the world's greats. His clients were very rich, yet he did not ever divert from his course of the 5 points of architecture. Soon in the 1930s, he turned to developing countries, particularly Latin America, where he hoped to construct new cities like that which he proposed and was rejected for in Paris. He was convinced that was where there was the greatest need. So in Rio de Janeiro, Le Corbusier spent a long time filming the poor with his personal camera and living with them. He had a real empathy for the poor and the disadvantaged. He wanted to build for them more than just for his rich clients. But no governments in Latin America took the bait. But the Second World War offered him new hope again in Europe. Him and many other European architects were impatient for war to break out in the 1930s. They were preparing for it. His generation of architects in Europe thought that the destruction of cities was a positive thing, and so he, along with many others, actually welcomed the bombs falling on the cities. And in 1945, the bombers had done their work. It was time for reconstruction to begin. So as a result, in the 1950s, there was this great need for affordable and efficient housing solutions to replace the destruction within cities for the rapidly growing urban population. And Le Corbusier came up with an idea for a self-contained modernist housing unit that would offer residents all the amenities of a small town within a single building, so that citizens who lost their city centers didn't have to wait for their new towns to be rebuilt. So in 1946, the Ministry of Public Reconstruction in Marseille engaged Le Corbusier to work on this ambitious social housing program dubbed the Unité de Habitation. Many fans called his work the foundation stone for the city of the future. And, indeed, he would build this prototype in 4 more European cities that had gotten bombed out. Le Corbusier proposed essentially this vertical city that surpasses waste, takes charge of the most burdensome domestic tasks, and organizes and encourages people to meet one another and make friendships. So how did it do all this? How did it create a vertical city which you really would never have to leave? So first and foremost, this apartment complex was built like a cabinet with shelves, right? So you had the cabinet, which is essentially the Domino plan, and then these 2-story apartments are inserted into the Domino plan as if they were drawers in a cabinet. So you have this overlap of 2-story apartments, creating this sort of skip-stop circulation system of corridors every 3rd floor. So if you can see in the bottom right-hand picture, every apartment is this kind of L-shaped plan with either a elongated basement or an elongated 2nd story. And then the space in between, the open gap left in between, is the hallway to get between the apartments. So it was maximizing the space that individual families were afforded to make it feel like a proper house, to make it feel a lot less cramped than the typical apartment buildings at the time. And while, the cabinet of the building is reinforced concrete, the apartment buildings themselves are very light. The apartment perimeter is a wood box of plywood sheathing in pine framing, insulated with fiberglass, so these could be lifted individually by cranes and slid into the cabinet that is the Domino plan, the reinforced concrete cabinet. And I'm using a cabinet metaphor, but Le Corbusier himself used a wine rack metaphor. So, the wine bottles were inserted into the wine rack that was the concrete frame. And so this wine rack frame, as he would say, holding the apartments, sits on a table essentially, which is supported by hollow feet that gather and redisperse the systems of supply and waste and allow pedestrian space underneath the apartments. And so all of the units, the wine bottles themselves, were designed to accommodate the nuclear family, with the entrance through the kitchen, passing through the dining area before reaching this double height living area. So the parents' room was usually located just up the stair above the dining area on the upper level, with the bathroom, shower, and toilet nearby. And then the other side of the upper level ends with 2 bedrooms side by side, usually for the children. And obviously this standard was reversed in every other unit. So instead of going up the stairs to the bedroom, you go down the stairs. But, aside from just the apartments, how was this a proper vertical city which you would never have to leave, which had every amenity? So, to turn this high-rise apartment block into a proper community, Le Corbusier provided 2 specific areas where this community could flourish. So the first way was essentially providing a community street halfway up the block in the interior. So essentially halfway up the apartment building is an interior commercial street filled with various provisional shops for residents, as well as hotel rooms, cafes, and restaurants. And you can see what this looked like in the bottom center picture. And then on the roof, you have a nursery, a school, a rooftop garden, a gymnasium, a track, an outdoor theater, and a pool. And then, obviously using reinforced concrete, he could build the whole thing on stilts to free up the ground below so as not to obstruct pedestrian traffic. So essentially, the inhabitants benefited from everything on site that could be found in a city center: shops, a post office, a school, restaurants, offices, and a hotel. While on the huge roof terrace, he constructed this vast leisure area, just like a European city center, which would be found in a great courtyard before a great cathedral. But very important to Le Corbusier was the quality of housing. He wanted to offer the inhabitants what, at the time in the immediate post-war period, was still reserved for the rich: a comfortable and fashionable way of living. So this luxury was achieved by fitting out the apartments in a very modern style, the style that, only his rich clients were up until now hoarding. So, each room, as you can tell, let in lots of light with very large windows. They all featured a balcony with breathtaking views. And so, essentially, Le Corbusier creates this building where people in low financial brackets have the chance to look in one direction at the sea and in another direction at the mountains from every single apartment, because they're duplex apartments where above they can look one way and below they can look the other way, and they interlock. So, the public reaction to this was very mixed. Some critics saw the building as a monstrosity or a vertical slum, while others thought it was the future of post-World War II Europe. Nevertheless, the Unité de Habitation remains an absolute landmark in modern architecture, and its influence can be seen in numerous later buildings, especially these days in university dormitories. And then through the 1950s and 60s, despite not being spiritual at all, Le Corbusier's final life projects consisted of modernizing ecclesiastical architecture in new and innovative ways. Ronchamp is one of his greatest, most personal works, built just after his mother died. So the site of the chapel at Ronchamp, since the 4th century, served as a Christian church, and since the 13th century, it was a major pilgrimage site. But in the 19th century, the church at Ronchamp had been destroyed by artillery fire in World War II, and the parish had at their disposal a war indemnity grant, but few other resources. At first, the proposal was to rebuild the old Gothic church, but this proved far too costly. So Le Corbusier was asked, but at first he rejected. As an atheist, he stated that he would never work for a dead institution. This was a parish church for the Catholic Church. But the parish had an indomitable spirit. It was determined to have Le Corbusier build their new church, and they convinced him with the promise that he would be allowed to go all the way with his plans. So eventually, Le Corbusier was convinced, and he saw this project as an opportunity to create a modernist structure that embraced spirituality, rather than rejecting it or forcing spirituality through the lens of ancient architecture, which isn't very well understood by modern eyes. Before building, Le Corbusier became absolutely fascinated with the history of the various churches and chapels on the site and incorporated their rubble into the new concrete walls. And so the completed chapel shocked the architectural world. Those who revered Le Corbusier as a champion of reason saw the freeform chapel as an expressionist, irrational departure. But it was built like Le Corbusier's other buildings in the Dimino style, if not a free-form version of it, where the hollow concrete roof rests on reinforced concrete columns, which leaves the whitewashed concrete walls below bearing no weight, allowing them to be free in form. And to prove this, the walls stop just centimeters before the roof and let in just a crack of light. This makes the roof appear to float above the walls. But the great source of inspiration for the shape of Ronchamp was the landscape. The wall plan is essentially 4 curved lines as an acoustical response to the 4 horizons viewed from the hilltop on which the chapel sits. So when the walls bow in, it indicates an outlying valley, and then when the walls bow out, it indicates an outlying mountain range. But the site's history as a sacred place also entered into the design of this chapel. The original church was associated with a statue of the Virgin Mary, which was known to have mystical powers, which was known to perform miracles. So the site's association with the Virgin Mary led Le Corbusier to use the sort of sensual form of the female body found in his paintings. It was, in a way, a 3-dimensional pierced painting of the Virgin Mary. So how did Ronchamp Chapel function with this very unique form of architecture? So, outside on the south end, you can see in the biggest picture, there was this open air altar, mimicking the open air altars of the Israelites, which Le Corbusier wanted to be the primary place of worship provided the weather was decent. Remember his manifesto, sun, space, and trees. But then, on the inside, the chapel is covered in these concrete battered walls, kind of evoking the idea of a sacred cave. But the use of light is the most distinctive feature of Ronchamp Chapel. It's the decorative feature of, all the Corbusier's building, and here it's achieved through these varying perimeter windows in the south wall. So these southern windows, you'll notice they only light up really half of the interior, specifically the seating area for the parishioners, as if to create, a physical appearance of the divine touching the parishioners. At the right times of day, God rays would come down and only appear over them, emphasizing, their very Christian role as divine creations, as beings of light, as beloved sons and daughters of God. And then finally, the chapel features 3 towers, these kind of half cylindrical forms of the towers that act as light wells for 3 small chapels within them, designed, for prayer and very private contemplation, creating this intimate visual separation from the nave. They're all painted in separate primary colors. So Le Corbusier's fame spread as a great church builder within the less traditional Catholic world. And so in 1953, Le Corbusier was commissioned to design a Dominican priory. So Dominican friar Alain Courtier, which you can see on this slide, was the client who contacted Le Corbusier. He considered Le Corbusier's atheism secondary to the sacred value inherent in his architecture. Alain observed that 20th century religious art had not evolved from the pseudo-Romanesque and the pseudo-Gothic and the Baroque. And, he actually believed that this was a disgrace, this was an offense to God. How, churches had not evolved with the artistic expressions of humanity, but were stuck as expressions of the past, as if Christianity was of the past and not a living religion. And so, over the course of his life, this friar, through his book, The Sacred Art, sought to convince the church to draw upon artists of its time. And so, yes, he befriended Le Corbusier in 1953 and was able to also persuade his Dominican brothers in the old monastery to accept him. So, the monastery was to house the intellectual and spiritual training of novice Dominicans, novice monks who would live, eat, study, and minister there. And, Le Corbusier himself was very excited for such a project, even though he was an atheist. He loved the idea of creating a monastic structure based on streamlining the monastic balance of the individual and the collective, a mode of life that he believed brought the most happiness. But Le Corbusier himself personally aspired to certain monastic values. The material simplicity and minimalism of the Dominicans absolutely intrigued him, and he was excited with the prospect of improving upon it with modern materials and modern architecture. And so the monastery consists of these 4 heavy rectangular structures that created this enclosed interior space, this cloister essentially, much like traditional monasteries. And so the monastery was designed to have 100 bedrooms for apprentices and teachers, study rooms, 1 workplace, and 1 entertainment room, a dining room, a library, and finally a church. And every one of the 100 cells features this outward-facing balcony slotted in just like the Unité de Habitation, with communal areas underneath and the cloister running around the roof. The monastery does not show off. It is on the inside that it lives, so much of the personality of this building is found in the interior, like the chapter room and the refectory with their commanding west-facing views over the valley. The interior of the church, though, is essentially a concrete box, an early experiment in brutalism, which is, given kind of a spiritual essence through its very simple, natural light and strong color. So these, what's called light cannons, are created as different types of openings around the church to let in colored daylight, several which are kind of sculpted on the exterior. And, these colors give a warm, evocative, and meditative glow, but they're essentially light scopes that refract light into the interior in the primary colors, so that, the monks can focus on their spirituality and aren't distracted by the usual kind of dogmatic artistic presence in typical Catholic churches. Over time, though, attendance at this Dominican community dropped for, I think obvious reasons. This might have been a little bit too much of a soul-sucking community for a lot of the monks. But over time, the Dominican community kind of transformed the site into more of a cultural center. So today it kind of ceases to be a fully devoted monastery, and it's home to art exhibitions, Christian seminars, and spiritual retreats, but it still functions for a reduced population of Dominican friars. And Le Corbusier left one final work to the world, unfinished at his death in 1965 actually, and neglected until it was finished 41 years later in 2006, and this is the St. Pierre Church. So, it stands in this old mining and industrial city of Firminy. The Church of Firminy was one of a set of community buildings designed by Le Corbusier slowly throughout his life. Among these are an Olympic stadium, a youth club and cultural center, a standard housing complex, and finally another unitated habitation. So this is one of these cities that had been bombed out in World War II, and Le Corbusier really committed to reviving this city center with not only his apartment complex but also a score of other public buildings. And among these public buildings, Le Corbusier was tasked with rebuilding the original town church, and obviously he chose a very modern kind of brutalist style. He said very famously he wanted to create a space with this church that was so vast that the heart might feel at ease in it, so high that prayers might breathe in it. And I think he more than accomplished this. On the inside, natural light floods in through light cannons just like in his priory, and also through a series of very small openings just behind the altar in the shape of the constellation Orion, but otherwise there are no windows. Being inspired from his priory, the space inside here too is completely cut off from all distraction, allowing the parishioners to completely focus on their connection with the divine. And amazingly, these light cannons are positioned in such a way so that they'll illuminate the altar on specific holidays in different colors, like on Good Friday and on Easter Sunday. And this is something that has never been attempted in a historical Catholic church, but Le Corbusier's use of modern materials and modern architecture has allowed him to do this. And finally, the shape of the church has a little bit of theology behind it as well. You'll notice the church starts as a square base and then projects upward into a circle, and as Le Corbusier would say, this stands for a transition from the earthly to the spiritual realm, from the rational to the spiritual, from the precise square to the undefined circle. So in the end, Le Corbusier's design was picked up and implemented in 1973, and as I said, the building was completed in 2006 by French architect José Aubry, who studied under Le Corbusier for many years as an apprentice. And finally, we come to the end of Le Corbusier's life. So in 1952, the great architect was at the peak of his career. Yeah, he was kind of leaning toward a more, frugal lifestyle, even asceticism. He went to the shores of the Mediterranean to retire in southern France and constructed this very simple wooden cabin where he would spend all of his time. He lived in a small closed world of 16 square meters with just the bare essentials. Only his observation of the surrounding nature seemed to matter, and he lived this way, becoming friends with the local community. But then, on the 27th of August 1965, elderly Le Corbusier went bathing in the ocean just outside his cabin, just as he did every day, but on this day he would never return. Le Corbusier remains a controversial figure. He invented brutalism. Some of his urban planning ideas have been criticized for their indifference to pre-existing cultural sites and societal expressions, but he was trying to create something international, something equitable. He wanted to do away with cultural divisions and build a pan-human world.